He believed every locked door in his mansion hid a secret worth controlling, but the one he opened by mistake revealed a heart far greater than his own. Adrian DeLuca rarely returned home before midnight. The sprawling estate overlooking Lake Michigan had long since fallen silent by the time his black sedan rolled beneath the stone archway, its headlights briefly illuminating the rows of oak trees lining the circular drive. The mansion stood like a monument to discipline and order, every light exactly where it belonged, every employee following routines that never changed. Adrian preferred it that way. Predictability made life easier. Surprises usually came with a price. He stepped inside without a word, loosening the knot of his dark tie as the grandfather clock in the foyer chimed 11. The house staff had already retired to the servants' quarters, leaving only the soft hum of antique air vents and the faint crackle from a dying fireplace somewhere down the hall. Even the marble floors seemed quieter than usual beneath his polished shoes. After 14 exhausting hours of meetings, paperwork, and endless decisions, all Adrian wanted was sleep. He climbed the curved staircase toward the second floor, barely noticing that one of the hallway sconces had burned out, leaving a stretch of corridor wrapped in shadows. Normally, he would have walked straight into his bedroom, but fatigue clouded habits built over decades. Instead of turning left, he turned right. His hand settled on a bronze doorknob almost without thought. The door opened with barely a whisper. Warm light spilled across the hallway. Adrian froze before taking another step. It wasn't his room. The space was modest, hardly larger than the walk-in closet attached to his own suite. A neatly made twin bed rested against one wall. A worn wooden dresser supported a tiny lamp with a beige shade. Folded uniforms sat in perfect stacks beside a pair of inexpensive sneakers. The room belonged to Grace Carter, the quiet housemaid whose name he knew only because it appeared on payroll reports once a month. She stood near the single window with her back to the door, completely unaware she was no longer alone. She had changed out of her work uniform into a simple gray sweatshirt and loose cotton pants, her natural curls wrapped beneath a satin scarf. Her shoulders looked tired in a way expensive vacations could never fix. Yet there was something gentle about the way she moved. She wasn't speaking to herself. She was speaking to someone hidden beyond Adrian's view. Her voice was barely above a whisper, soft enough to disappear beneath the steady rain tapping against the window. "It's okay," she murmured with a smile that no one in the mansion had ever seen. "You remembered my name today. That's enough for tonight." Adrian instinctively leaned back into the darkness of the hallway, his heartbeat slowing instead of quickening. Another quiet voice answered, too faint for him to understand. Grace laughed, not loudly, but with the kind of warmth that transformed the tiny room into something brighter than the mansion's grand ballroom had ever felt. She picked up a worn children's storybook from the nightstand and carefully opened it, smoothing the pages with remarkable tenderness before beginning to read. Every sentence carried patience. Every pause carried affection. Adrian couldn't yet see who was listening, only the edge of an old rocking chair moving gently in the golden light. For reasons he couldn't explain, he found himself unable to leave. The man who believed he understood every person living beneath his roof suddenly realized there was an entire world hidden behind the smallest door in the house. And for the first time in years, he wanted to know what kind of person Grace Carter truly was. Adrian quietly eased the door back until only the narrowest crack remained, careful not to let the hinges betray his presence. He should have apologized and walked away the moment he realized he had entered the wrong room. Yet something about Grace's voice rooted him to the hallway. It carried no fear, no frustration, and none of the quiet exhaustion he usually associated with the employees who worked beneath his roof. Instead, it carried patience, the kind that could only come from someone who had practiced kindness long before anyone noticed. The gentle rocking continued, accompanied by the soft turning of another page. "Do you remember this part?" Grace asked warmly. "You always smiled when we reached this chapter." A faint reply drifted through the room, too weak for Adrian to distinguish, but it was enough to make Grace's face brighten as though she had just received wonderful news. She carefully set the book aside and adjusted a knitted blanket over the unseen figure sitting in the rocking chair. Only then did Adrian catch a glimpse of silver hair illuminated beneath the lamp. It was an elderly woman. The realization surprised him. None of his employment records mentioned anyone living inside the mansion besides the staff. Grace reached for a small tray resting beside the chair. A bowl of warm soup released curls of steam into the air. She stirred it patiently before offering a careful spoonful. "Take your time," she whispered. "There is no rush tonight." The woman accepted only a tiny bite before looking away, seemingly distracted by something invisible. Grace never showed the slightest sign of disappointment. She simply smiled again and waited. Adrian had negotiated multi-million-dollar agreements with less patience than this young woman displayed over a single spoonful of soup. His attention drifted around the room. There were no expensive decorations, no electronics beyond a small clock radio, and no signs of luxury despite the enormous estate surrounding them. Instead, every shelf held practical things: folded towels, bottles of medicine, family photographs tucked into inexpensive frames. One picture caught Adrian's eye. It showed a much younger Grace standing beside the same elderly woman outside a modest white church somewhere in the countryside. Both were laughing with genuine happiness. Another photograph showed Grace wearing a high school graduation gown, while the elderly woman proudly held a bouquet of grocery store flowers. Adrian suddenly realized the woman was not merely a visitor. She was the center of Grace's world. He quietly stepped farther into the shadow, so neither of them would notice him. During the months Grace had worked in his home, she had never once asked for special treatment. She had never complained about long hours, never requested extra days off, never explained why she sometimes looked tired before sunrise. The payroll manager had even remarked that Grace consistently volunteered to cover additional shifts whenever another employee called in sick. Adrian had assumed she simply wanted overtime. Now that assumption no longer felt complete. Grace gently took the elderly woman's hands into her own. "Tomorrow will be another good day," she said softly. "Even if you forget my face again, I will still remember yours." The words settled over the room with remarkable peace. Adrian felt something unfamiliar stir inside him. Not guilt exactly, but an uncomfortable awareness that he had spent years believing he knew how to judge character simply by reading reports and observing efficiency. Standing outside that modest room, he began to understand that the most meaningful parts of a person's life never appeared on payroll forms or performance reviews. They existed in moments like this, hidden behind doors no one thought to open. Adrian did not sleep that night. Long after the mansion settled into complete silence, he remained seated beside the tall windows of his study, watching the rain slide down the glass, while Grace's quiet words echoed through his mind. "Tomorrow will be another good day. Even if you forget my face again, I will still remember yours." He had spent years surrounded by people who measured loyalty through contracts, salaries, and obligations. Yet nothing he had witnessed inside that modest room resembled duty. It looked like love freely given, without applause and without expectation. By sunrise, Adrian had convinced himself that what he saw had simply been an unusual moment. Even so, curiosity lingered where certainty usually lived. The following evening, after finishing dinner with several business associates, Adrian returned home earlier than usual. The estate buzzed with familiar routines. Housekeepers polished crystal chandeliers. Gardeners finished trimming hedges before dusk settled across the property. Grace moved quietly through the hallway carrying freshly folded linens, her expression calm, her eyes lowered with the same respectful professionalism she showed every day. If she noticed Adrian watching her from across the foyer, she gave no indication. She simply greeted him with a gentle smile before continuing toward the upstairs guest rooms. There was nothing remarkable about her appearance. She blended into the background as though invisibility had become second nature. Adrian suddenly realized that he had encouraged exactly that culture inside his home. Employees were praised for efficiency, not humanity. They completed assignments, avoided unnecessary conversations, and disappeared once their work ended. He had never questioned whether they carried lives beyond these walls. That evening, just before 11, Adrian found himself standing outside his study with an uncomfortable awareness that he was waiting rather than working. Sure enough, Grace quietly crossed the hallway carrying a small canvas tote instead of her cleaning supplies. She glanced around to ensure no one needed assistance before slipping down the servant corridor. Adrian hesitated only a moment before following at a respectful distance. He had no intention of frightening her or invading her privacy further. He simply wanted answers to questions that refused to leave his mind. Grace moved carefully through the quiet mansion until she reached the same small room. She entered without noticing him, leaving the door slightly open this time. Adrian remained several feet away, hidden by the corner of the hallway. Through the narrow opening, he watched her unpack the canvas bag. Inside were fresh fruit, a pharmacy prescription, clean towels, and a tiny bouquet of yellow daisies wrapped in grocery store paper. She placed the flowers inside a glass jar filled with water before setting them beside the elderly woman's chair. The older woman looked toward the blooms with childlike wonder. "Beautiful," she whispered. Grace smiled. "You always loved yellow flowers. They make the room feel happier." The elderly woman studied Grace's face for several long seconds before quietly asking, "Are you my daughter?" Adrian held his breath. Grace did not hesitate. She gently squeezed the woman's hand and answered with complete peace. "Tonight, I can be whatever helps you feel safe." There was no correction, no disappointment, no trace of frustration, only kindness offered without condition. The elderly woman's shoulders relaxed almost immediately, and a grateful smile slowly appeared. Adrian felt something shift deep inside him. He had expected to uncover a secret that required explanation. Instead, he had discovered a compassion so quiet and so unwavering that it asked for nothing in return, and for reasons he could not yet explain, it left him questioning the kind of man he had become. For the next several days, Adrian found himself noticing details that had somehow escaped him for years. Grace always arrived before sunrise, long before the kitchen staff unlocked the pantry or the gardeners started their equipment. She quietly brewed coffee for the overnight security team before preparing breakfast trays for the house staff, even though neither task appeared anywhere in her job description. When another employee accidentally dropped a basket of freshly pressed linens across the marble hallway, Grace knelt without hesitation and helped gather every folded sheet before returning to her own work. She never expected thanks. Most people simply assumed she had been responsible from the beginning. Adrian watched these small moments from a distance, saying nothing. The mansion had always functioned with remarkable efficiency, yet he was beginning to understand that much of that harmony rested on invisible acts of kindness performed by someone almost no one acknowledged. One rainy afternoon, he passed through the service corridor and noticed Grace carefully repairing the loose strap on an elderly housekeeper's worn handbag with a simple sewing kit. The older woman smiled with quiet relief, and Grace only shrugged as though it were the most ordinary thing in the world. Later that evening, Adrian happened to glance through payroll reports and realized Grace regularly accepted the smallest overtime payments while declining opportunities that would have earned her larger bonuses if they required leaving early from the mansion. The numbers made little sense until he remembered the elderly woman waiting. Inside the small room upstairs, every extra dollar appeared to serve a purpose beyond Grace herself. Curiosity slowly transformed into admiration, but Adrian still knew almost nothing about her life before she arrived at the estate. The answer came unexpectedly one quiet evening as he paused outside the familiar doorway once again. Grace sat beside the elderly woman with an old photo album resting across both their laps. One by one, she turned the fragile pages while speaking gently enough that the conversation felt more like a prayer than a story. "This was the little house where you found me," Grace said with a soft smile, pointing to a faded photograph of a white farmhouse surrounded by wildflowers. "I was 8 years old, scared of everyone, and convinced nobody wanted me anymore." The elderly woman stared at the picture with uncertain eyes. "Did I know you?" she asked quietly. Grace nodded without the slightest trace of sadness. "You knew me before I even knew myself." She turned another page, revealing a picture of a younger version of the same woman standing beside a shy little girl wearing oversized overalls and holding a library book almost as large as her chest. "You taught me how to read every evening after dinner. You told me that books could become windows whenever life felt too small." Another page revealed a graduation photograph. "When I finished high school, you worked extra shifts at the church pantry just to buy me that bouquet. You said every milestone deserved flowers, even if they came from the grocery store." The elderly woman reached toward the photograph with trembling fingers, searching for memories that no longer remained. "I wish I could remember," she whispered, tears gathering in her eyes. Grace gently rested her hand over hers. "You do not have to remember every chapter," she answered with quiet certainty. "You already gave me the most important ones." Now it is my turn to remember them for both of us. Standing unseen beyond the doorway, Adrian lowered his eyes. He had spent years believing gratitude belonged in speeches, awards, and public gestures. Yet here, inside the smallest room of his enormous home, gratitude lived through. Simple faithfulness repeated every single day. In that silent moment, the mansion no longer felt as grand as it once had, because the greatest measure of wealth was not hidden inside its marble walls. It was sitting beside an old rocking chair, patiently returning a lifetime of love that could no longer remember its own beginning. The photo album remained on Adrian's mind long after the hallway had emptied and the lights inside Grace's room had gone dark. For the first time in years, he postponed reviewing financial reports and left the folders untouched on his desk. Instead, he stood beside the broad windows overlooking the lake, watching the moon reflect across the still water while memories he had buried long ago quietly resurfaced. He remembered a much smaller house on the edge of a quiet neighborhood, where his own mother had once waited by the front porch every evening no matter how late he came home from school. She never owned expensive jewelry. She never traveled beyond the neighboring states. Yet she somehow made every ordinary day feel important. She had insisted that kindness was the only investment that always earned interest. As a young man determined to build an empire, Adrian had dismissed those words as sentimental. Success demanded discipline, not softness. At least that was what he had convinced himself for more than 2 decades. Somewhere along the journey, boardrooms replaced family dinners, contracts replaced conversations, and efficiency replaced compassion. Standing alone in the silence of his study, Adrian slowly realized that he could remember the exact value of every property he owned, but he struggled to remember the last time he had asked another person how they were truly doing. The realization settled heavily upon him. The following morning, Adrian entered the mansion's dining room earlier than usual. Members of the household staff quietly prepared breakfast before beginning another busy day. Grace carried a tray of fresh fruit toward the kitchen, moving with the same calm focus she always displayed. One of the younger employees accidentally bumped into her shoulder, causing several apples to roll across the polished floor. Before anyone could react, Grace smiled gently and knelt to gather them. The young employee looked embarrassed and immediately apologized. Grace simply answered, "Everyone has difficult mornings. It is all right." She even handed the employee one of the undamaged apples before continuing on her way. Adrian watched the exchange from the far end of the room. Nobody else seemed to notice it. Nobody applauded. Nobody thanked her. Grace behaved the same whether someone was watching or not. That quiet consistency impressed him more than any grand gesture ever could. Later that afternoon, Adrian requested several personnel files from the estate manager under the simple explanation that he wished to review employee records personally. The folders arrived neatly organized across his desk. Grace Carter's file was surprisingly thin. Excellent attendance. Outstanding performance evaluations. No disciplinary reports. No requests for extended leave. No complaints. No special accommodations. There was only one handwritten note from the woman who had interviewed her nearly 2 years earlier. It read, "Exceptional character. Places others before herself. Rarely speaks about personal hardship." Adrian read that single sentence several times. Somehow those few words now carried more weight than pages filled with business statistics. As evening settled over the estate once again, Adrian found himself walking more slowly through the familiar hallways. The mansion had not changed. The polished wood still reflected warm light. The marble floors still echoed beneath every careful step. Yet everything felt different because his perspective had changed. Behind one modest door lived a woman who quietly repaid love with unwavering devotion, and behind another door stood a man who suddenly understood that all his accomplishments had never taught him the lesson his mother once tried to give him for free. For the first time in many years, Adrian lowered his head, closed his eyes for a brief moment, and silently wished she were still alive so he could tell her she had been right all along. The change began so quietly that no one inside the mansion noticed it except Adrian himself. He no longer rushed past the employees as though they were part of the furniture. Instead, he observed them with the same attention he once reserved only for important negotiations. He noticed who greeted others with kindness, who quietly carried heavier workloads, and who smiled only after everyone else had left the room. Again and again, his eyes returned to Grace. One crisp autumn morning, sunlight poured through the tall kitchen windows as the breakfast staff prepared trays for the household. Grace arrived earlier than usual, yet there were dark circles beneath her eyes that even her warm smile could not completely hide. She moved a little slower than before, pausing briefly against the counter before lifting another basket of fresh bread. Adrian happened to enter through the side hallway at that exact moment. Grace quickly straightened her posture and continued working as though nothing had happened. Most people would have missed the brief hesitation. Adrian did not. Throughout the day, he noticed other small signs. She skipped lunch, insisting she was not hungry when another employee offered to share homemade soup. She quietly declined an afternoon break, explaining that several guest rooms still needed fresh linens. Late that evening, after finishing her regular duties, she carried the familiar canvas tote upstairs with noticeably tired steps. Adrian waited until she disappeared into the small room before walking toward the estate manager's office. "Has Grace requested any time off recently?" he asked. The manager looked surprised by the question. "No, sir. She actually refuses extra leave whenever we offer it. She says someone depends on her every evening." Adrian nodded thoughtfully. "Has anyone asked whether she is all right?" The manager hesitated. "She always says she is fine." Those simple words stayed with Adrian. The following afternoon, while reviewing invoices in his study, he noticed a folded receipt lying inside one of the personnel envelopes that had accidentally been included with Grace's payroll paperwork. It was not confidential medical information, only a pharmacy purchase that Grace had apparently tucked into the wrong folder by mistake before collecting her check. The total came to nearly half of her weekly earnings. Adrian quietly folded the receipt and returned it to the envelope without another word. That evening, he once again found himself near the familiar hallway. Through the slightly open door, he watched Grace helping the elderly woman settle beneath a blanket before preparing a simple dinner. The older woman smiled peacefully, but Grace's hands trembled ever so slightly as she lifted a glass of water. After making certain her companion was comfortable, Grace stepped into the tiny adjoining bathroom. She leaned both hands against the sink and closed her eyes. For several silent seconds, she simply stood there, taking slow breaths as though gathering enough strength to finish another day. Then she splashed cool water across her face, smiled gently at her own reflection, and walked back into the room carrying the same quiet warmth she always offered everyone else. She never allowed the elderly woman to see her exhaustion. Adrian remained hidden in the hallway, unexpectedly moved by the quiet courage unfolding only a few feet away. Grace never complained. She never asked for help. She carried responsibility with such grace that the burden itself became invisible. Adrian finally understood that true strength rarely announced itself with loud words or dramatic moments. Sometimes it looked like a tired young woman choosing to smile before walking back into a room where someone else needed hope more than she needed rest. Standing there in complete silence, Adrian made a decision. Grace would never know he had witnessed that private moment, but she would no longer carry every burden alone if he had the power to change it. The next Monday morning began like every other one inside the DeLuca estate, yet Adrian quietly set into motion a series of changes that no one could trace back to him. Before sunrise, he met privately with the estate manager and spoke in the calm, measured voice that had guided countless important decisions over the years. This time, however, the subject was not business growth or property maintenance. "Effective immediately," he said, "every full-time employee will receive expanded health benefits, additional paid personal leave, and access to a family assistance fund if someone they care for becomes seriously ill. Nobody needs to earn the right to ask for help." The manager blinked in surprise, quickly taking notes without questioning the decision. Adrian added one final instruction. "Do not announce that this came from me. Present it as a permanent policy of the estate." By lunchtime, quiet conversations spread through the staff dining room. Housekeepers exchanged puzzled smiles. Gardeners looked at one another in disbelief. Several longtime employees admitted they had never expected such generous changes. Grace listened politely while pouring coffee into ceramic mugs, offering the same gentle smile she always did. She seemed genuinely happy for everyone else, yet she never imagined the new policies had anything to do with her. That evening, Adrian placed another discreet phone call, this time to a respected home health organization that specialized in caring for older adults experiencing memory loss. He requested information, not favors. He asked about visiting nurses, physical therapy, counseling, and support programs for caregivers who often forgot to care for themselves. Every recommendation was carefully written into a leather notebook that had once held only financial projections. 2 days later, a representative from a local charitable foundation contacted Grace during her afternoon break. The woman explained that an anonymous donor had expanded a community program designed to help elderly residents remain comfortably at home with professional support. Grace listened in stunned silence as she learned that weekly nursing visits, medication assistance, and caregiver resources would all be available at no cost. She thanked the caller repeatedly, convinced that someone somewhere had made an administrative mistake. That evening, she shared the unexpected news with the elderly woman while preparing dinner. "Can you believe it?" Grace said with a soft laugh that sounded lighter than Adrian had ever heard before. "Someone I will probably never meet decided to help people like us." The elderly woman smiled warmly, even though she could not fully understand the conversation. "There are good people everywhere," she whispered. Grace nodded. "I hope they know how much they have changed someone's life." Standing unnoticed outside the familiar doorway, Adrian quietly closed his eyes. For the first time in many years, helping another person brought him a peace that no successful negotiation or expensive purchase had ever provided. Days turned into weeks, and the changes continued to ripple through the mansion. Employees laughed more often during meals. They checked on one another instead of rushing past with lowered heads. The atmosphere slowly softened, not because anyone had been ordered to behave differently, but because one quiet act of compassion had inspired another. Adrian realized that leadership did not always begin with authority. Sometimes it began with example, even if that example came from the person everyone had overlooked. Grace never asked who the anonymous donor was. She simply continued living exactly as she always had, caring for the elderly woman with patient devotion, offering kindness without keeping score, and walking through the halls with the same quiet humility. Yet every evening, as Adrian passed the small room at the end of the corridor, he no longer saw the plain wooden door that had once seemed insignificant. He saw the place where the measure of his own life had quietly begun to change. Nearly 2 months passed before Grace discovered that kindness often leaves footprints, even when someone tries to erase them. It happened on an ordinary Thursday afternoon after she accompanied the elderly woman to a routine appointment with one of the visiting nurses. The nurse carefully reviewed a folder filled with updated care schedules before smiling warmly. "Whoever established this support program clearly thought about every detail," she said. "The donor even requested additional memory therapy sessions after reading your caregiver assessment." Grace looked up in surprise. "Reading my assessment?" The nurse paused, suddenly realizing she had said more than intended. "I assumed you knew." Grace gently shook her head. "I was only told that a charitable foundation expanded its services." The nurse smiled apologetically. "Technically, that is true. The foundation received one private contribution specifically asking that no recognition ever be given to the person providing the assistance." Grace thanked her politely, but the conversation stayed with her throughout the drive back to the estate. Someone had not simply donated money. Someone had quietly learned about her situation, asked careful questions, and continued helping without expecting gratitude. That evening, after settling the elderly woman comfortably into her rocking chair with another favorite storybook, Grace walked slowly through the nearly empty hallway. As she passed the estate office, the door stood slightly open. The manager was organizing employee files before locking up for the night. "Grace," he called kindly, "could you leave these updated benefits forms in the staff lounge tomorrow morning?" She nodded and accepted the folder. As she turned to leave, a single sheet slipped onto the hardwood floor. She instinctively bent to retrieve it before the manager noticed. Across the top appeared the familiar letterhead of the charitable foundation. Attached beneath it was a brief, handwritten instruction. "Please ensure all communication remains anonymous as requested by Mr. Adrian DeLuca." Grace froze. For a long moment, she simply stared at the name before quietly returning the paper to its place. She said nothing. The manager thanked her, unaware of what she had seen. Later that night, Adrian stepped into the library carrying a cup of black coffee, expecting another quiet evening of reading. Instead, He found Grace standing beside the tall windows overlooking the moonlit gardens. She turned as he entered. There was no anger in her expression, no embarrassment, and no expectation. Only calm understanding. Adrian immediately recognized that something had changed. Before he could speak, Grace offered a gentle smile. "I know," she said softly. The room became perfectly still. Adrian considered denying it, but the truth no longer felt like something that needed hiding. He slowly set the coffee cup on a nearby table. "I did not want you to feel indebted," he answered honestly. Grace looked toward the gardens for a moment before speaking again. "You never tried to make me feel that way." She took one quiet step closer. "You saw someone carrying more than she could manage, and you chose to help without asking for anything in return." Adrian lowered his eyes. "I almost did nothing," he admitted. "If I had not opened the wrong door that night, I might have continued believing I understood the people who lived under this roof." Grace smiled gently, her eyes reflecting gratitude rather than surprise. "Then perhaps neither of us was in the wrong place." She paused before adding the words Adrian would remember for the rest of his life. "Thank you for seeing me when nobody else ever did." Adrian searched for an answer worthy of that moment, yet none came. After years of speaking with complete confidence in every boardroom and every negotiation, he discovered that silence sometimes carried greater honesty than words. He simply nodded with quiet respect, and in that silent exchange both of them understood that genuine kindness never diminished the dignity of the person receiving it. Instead, it restored the humanity of the person giving it. 1 year later, the DeLuca estate no longer felt like a mansion where people simply worked. It felt like a place where people belonged. Fresh flowers appeared in the staff dining room every Monday morning. Birthdays were quietly celebrated with homemade desserts prepared by the kitchen team. Employees no longer hurried through the hallways with their eyes fixed on the floor. They greeted one another by name, shared meals when schedules allowed, and checked on anyone who seemed unusually tired. None of those traditions had existed before. Adrian never claimed credit for the changes. He simply encouraged every thoughtful idea that brought people closer together. Grace remained exactly who she had always been. She still arrived before sunrise, still folded every towel with the same careful attention, and still ended each evening beside the elderly woman who had once given her a home when she had nowhere else to go. The difference was that she no longer carried every responsibility by herself. The visiting nurses became trusted friends. The elderly woman's laughter grew more frequent, even if her memories still came and went like gentle waves. Some afternoons, she recognized Grace immediately. Other days, she asked the same questions again. Grace answered each one with the same patient smile because love had never depended upon being remembered. One cool evening in early autumn, Adrian walked through the second-floor corridor after returning from another long day away from the estate. The familiar hallway was quiet except for the distant sound of pages turning inside the small room at the end. He slowed his pace as he approached the door that had unknowingly changed the direction of his life. A year earlier, he would have reached for the handle without thinking. This time he stopped. He raised his hand and knocked softly. There was a brief pause before Grace's warm voice answered. "Come in." Adrian opened the door with quiet respect. The elderly woman sat comfortably in her rocking chair beneath the same knitted blanket. A new vase of bright yellow daisies rested on the windowsill beside the old photo album that now looked well-loved from being opened so often. Grace looked up from the storybook she had been reading and smiled. "She remembered my name twice today," she said happily. The elderly woman looked toward Adrian and smiled as well. "You are the gentleman who always knocks," she said gently. Adrian returned the smile, feeling something inside him soften once again. "I am trying to remember my manners," he replied. Grace laughed quietly, and for a moment the room felt brighter than the afternoon sunlight shining through the window. No expensive artwork hanging elsewhere in the mansion had ever carried as much beauty as that simple scene before him. As Adrian stepped back into the hallway a few minutes later, he looked once more at the small wooden door. It had never been grand. It had never stood out among the polished walls of the estate. Yet behind it he had discovered a lesson that every success, every achievement, and every possession had failed to teach him. Real strength was gentle. Real wealth was measured by the lives we quietly lifted. Real leadership began by seeing the dignity in people others overlooked. Adrian continued down the hallway with slower, steadier steps than the man who had once walked there without noticing anyone around him. Some doors are opened by accident, but the lives they change are transformed by choice. And on that quiet estate overlooking Lake Michigan, the world did not remember the size of the mansion or the influence of the man who owned it. It remembered the quiet kindness of a Black Maid who never stopped loving, and the day a powerful man finally learned what true dignity looked like.